This interview is with Willard Hines of Oklahoma City. Today's date is January 11, 1991. And the interview is being conducted by Roger Harris with Oklahoma Historical Society. And the location of the interview is in Mr. Hines' home in Oklahoma City.
I'm a native of Arkansas. My commander in the Navy, I was stationed at Corpus Christi during World War II. And the commander there of the technical installation, PA sub, became manager of WKY Radio after the war. And when he left the island, he'd taken a list of all the instructors, so that if he ever needed any technical men, he'd know where to get a hold of them. And that's how I got lured to Oklahoma City. I was instructing aviation radio and radar, stuff like that in the Navy at Corpus Christi. I grew up 50 miles east of Little Rock, in the Rice District of Arkansas. I was servicing radios before I went to the Navy. Family business was farming, and in my early years, radio tubes and radio fascinated me, and that's how I got in radio. Of course, back in those days, anybody that had any interest in electronics had any interest, there was always somebody out there to say, "Hey, I need some help. Come help me. I'll show you what I can do." And it's kind of, So I went from all the Stuttgart being one, which is 30 miles away. There was 2 or 3 radio technicians there. That every chance I got, I would go by and visit them. And, they kind of pushed me on as to keep learning. I actually started servicing radios back in about 39. That was about the only training that was available at that time. There was 1 or 2 correspondence courses available at that time, and that was about it. I had problems on the onset of getting merchandise not being available, and bucking a lot of the older dealers in town who had all of the major lines of equipment. So I was had to take what was left, and in 47, I believe it was, I moved to Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and started to finish my education at John Brown University. I left before I finished to come to work for WKY here in the city. That was August the 23rd, 1948. I was hired primarily for television, the idea of going into television, but my first duties when I arrived on duty was to go through training just like any of the other engineers at the Skirvin Hotel, operating the audio board. Mr. Sugg had, or the Oklahoma Publishing Company, had filed for a construction permit for television I guess early in 48. I'm not sure of the dates on that. And the construction permit and license, the construction permit was granted. Of course, the problem back then was getting equipment to get on the air. And that's why I was hired, was he thought that I might be a good technical man for television, even though I didn't know anything about television at the time. Of course, I was not the only one that brought. There were several from Mr. Sugg's command there at Ward Island that he had joined the company for this purpose. Oh, Ned Leach, he's still here in the city. Aaron Britton, which I knew very well there at the island. A Jack Hauser. He was not too technical oriented, but he was more of a camera operator type when he came aboard. Bob Swissgood, Bob Doty. I would say probably right after World War II, really, in their planning, because it seems that they had visions of television, not knowing really what it was or what it would do, but they did have a vision of it. Now, the exact date of this, I'm not informed of that. Actually, WKY and WKY-TV had not yet been assigned. WKY-FM was operating at the time. AM originally, and right after the war they went into FM. And of course the technology was not as it is today, and the stability of receiving equipment was not too good, and it really had trouble getting off of the ground. It was only, I don't remember whether they was the first FM station on, but probably pretty close to it, and I think there was only one or two other stations on the air at the time. I believe to get what the industry had boasted to get a noise-free reception at higher fidelity. They programmed FM separately pretty extensively for about a year, and I believe that was in 47. They had the separate programming on FM on the onset. Now, when I came in August of 48, FM broadcasting had cut back because of very few listeners. And at that time, they were simulcasting only from 3 in the afternoon until 10 o'clock at night on FM. So actually, and all of the announcers would give the station break, and they had fancy operating equipment that the same announcer, he'd just give the station break, WKY, push a button, FM released to Oklahoma City, so the word FM never went out on radio. So when he went in back to programming, either from records or disc or network, well, it was all simulcast. Well, it was all tube type. Of course, the transistor had not come to being then. And going from the radio frequency spectrum up to the FM spectrum band, technology was not to where the stability of the receiver itself. They had a tendency to drift, and it just wasn't really a good serviceable piece of merchandise. I actually never went on the board operating permanently at the Skirvin. I broke in and I run several shifts, but as far an assigned shift of say 5 to 1 o'clock or whatever, I worked that shift, but I was always with someone. And I'd say it was probably not over 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the most. Aaron Britton, another Ward Island man, came in a week later than I did, and we worked together. And the chief engineer then was Jack Lovell. He came in and got the two of us and says, you're to report to the transmitter building Monday morning. This is out here on Britton Road. For installation. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to install a 10 kilowatt FM amplifier. At that time, they was only running 3 kilowatts FM. And RCA had come out with this update retrofit kit to go to 10 kilowatts. So Aaron and I was transferred to the transmitter facility to install this 10 kilowatt amplifier. And this was, I'd say, had to be about the middle of September, somewhere like that. And back in those days, you just didn't do things without proper notification of the commission. I know when we got out there, Horace Meriden then was the transmitter supervisor. He says, well, we can't take this thing off the air until we get notification from the FCC. But here are the blueprints, schematics, what has to be done. So take these and study them and find out what you've got to do so that we can proceed when we get notification. And I don't know, I believe it was the next day or maybe Wednesday of that week that we got notification of FCC that we could take the FM off the air to install this amplifier. Of course, the time frame was not exactly known when we would get it back on the air. So they just signed the FM off, and we completely dismantled it, the original transmitter, because we had to, it was pretty extensive modification. And before we completed that, the television transmitter started arriving. All the equipment had been ordered way back before I joined the company. And so Aaron and I, after the completion of the FM, we started right on with the television transmitter, installing that. So we was out there basically all winter long, installing first the FM and then the television transmitter. The FM was out the center of the radio, of the FM spectrum, 98 point something, somewhere along in there. I'm not specific on the frequency. This had nothing to do with television at all.
I see.
After we got the television, and we had to remove the FM antenna on the tower and put up a television antenna, and RCA had built what they call a triplexer that would mix the television picture signal, television sound signal, and the FM signal all on that same antenna. So there was actually 3 radio signals on that one antenna on top of the tower. Not until the company decided to go to a higher power transmitter did they decide to drop FM. There was an awful lot of discussion on that. Basically, we could not go to maximum radiation on television, which was by the commission 100,000 watts effective radiation, which meant a 25 kilowatt transmitter. There wasn't a triplexer or any other mechanism built where they could triplex television of that high power and FM together. So they just decided to drop the FM station completely. So they signed the FM station off, and I think it was probably negotiations had been planned, and the equipment itself was donated to the Oklahoma City school system. The antenna, the old original FM antenna, is still on top of the old classroom school down at 17th and whatever that street is. But the equipment is long gone. Officially June the 6th, 1949, we had been on the air with test programming in the spring and so forth. Test pattern, and occasionally we put out some picture and sound of some film or We might have even had a remote or two on for test purposes only, but officially it was June the 6th, 1949. Lester Tucker, Jack Lovell, Bob Hayward, when I hired on, it was just as an engineer, and from what I did at the transmitter on the installation, and being able to solve problems, I'd say they appointed me maintenance supervisor, I'd say early 49. The company did send me to an RCA training school in February of 49 at RCA, Camden, New Jersey. That was the manufacturer of the broadcast equipment, camera equipment, and so forth. It was a 2-week training course. Basically, here is a camera. This is what you can do with it. This is what it will do, but what you do with it, they didn't really know because it was new to them too. While I was there, I did visit 2 television stations there in Philadelphia, which is just across the river. And they was anybody that had any interest in television, they seemed to take a hand. Well, why don't you come observe? I know one of the stations there in Philadelphia, the weekend that I was there and had nothing to do, they invited me to go with them on a remote. We had received some camera equipment. All of it was the field equipment, a remote type, and they had set up the equipment at the little theater there in the Municipal Auditorium. And Aaron and I had gone down for a tutoring session, and that was so we had seen the cameras. We knew see that they would how to produce a picture, sort of, but we didn't know exactly what we was doing because we was not too abreast of it. We was primarily interested in the installation of the transmitter at that time. But this only lasted like 4 or 5 days. It was just an RCA field technician came in and took the cameras up with cables and set a test pattern up and produced a picture. And that was about it. They were fairly well trained technically as to how to get a picture out of the camera. They were not trained as to what kind of light you got to have or what's going to make a pleasant picture on the air. All they knew was this is what knobs you do and this is how you do it to get the picture. They knew how to make the camera work. But what the camera looked at, they didn't have any experience of that. Got the television transmitter installed. We went moved back to the Municipal Auditorium to install the studio equipment. Of course, some of that, if you have record of it, some of it was installed along in late November by the rest of the crew. The control room equipment was up on the 3rd floor in what was the balcony. Projection room was up on the 4th floor. And of course they had modified the stage area, extended it out over the orchestra pit to give more operating room for cameras. Somewhere in November when we had to go down and get this tutoring from the RCA serviceman that showed us how to cable equipment up and how to make pictures. We just merely stacked the equipment up on the stage, what we call the stage. Actually, it was the center of the theater itself. And somewhere around December the 1st, date I'm not sure of, there was a fire. Because they was getting the building insulated, changing it to adapt it for television use, soundproofing, and so forth. And it was never determined exactly what caused the fire, but it started at noontime. It was either by some of the stage lights came in contact with some of the drapes or cigarette or something of that nature, but it started up in the old curtains. And all of these curtains, as they burned and the ropes burned, all that fell down on top of the television equipment. And I know Aaron and I had gone back to the transmitter, and we got word of this and along about I don't know, 3 o'clock or so. They asked us to come down and help. Well, the people who were there, Bob Hayward, who was in charge of the studio installation, they were all out at lunch at the time. And when they got back, he got with the fireman who had got there to put out everything, and told them what was involved under that pile. So they did their best to save it as much as possible. There was extensive smoke damage. Some of the equipment was damaged fairly severely, but due to the company's foresight, it was all insured, so it was all 100% replaced. So then after the replacement, they repurchased the fire damaged equipment. And that was one of my jobs then when I went back to the auditorium when we got through with the television transmitter part, was to rebuild its camera equipment. So on the onset, we was only going to have 3 cameras. 2 of the cameras was to be shuffled between the mobile unit and studio. Well, when we rebuilt the cameras and control equipment, and that gave us 5 cameras. One of them they didn't replace. So we ended up with 5 operating cameras, 2 of which we kept in the mobile unit almost all the time, and 3 then in the studio. So I think probably during this rebuilding, and they found what I could handle, they made me maintenance supervisor to keep the equipment going. Of course, that maintenance supervisor was a lot of title. I still had to do an awful lot of operating and maintaining the equipment. I didn't have anybody under me at that time. I just had to do it myself. And when we sort of outgrew the little theater, I knew there was something going on. It was kind of secretive, but I remember one time Gene Lyons, who was the remote supervisor, said he had to have somebody to operate a camera, set up the camera. He did not have the background to make a picture. But he could operate all of the other equipment, audio and stuff like that, which was his game. Out at the transmitter. Well, what they had done was made a copper box. And somebody built, some construction company, and it was not a very large box. It was big enough to put a camera and a man, might have been 6-foot square or something like this. But then it was this box was located approximately where the Channel 4 studio is now. Because the old mobile unit did not have any power, so they had to run power from the transmitter building over there to power this mobile unit. So what they did was set this camera in this copper box, and it was just a 1/4-inch screen mesh wire that was made of copper rather than galvanized hardware cloth, to see if they could get a picture without being interfered with WKY radio. And I found out later that what they had done was contacted RCA about moving the studio out here to the transmitter. Well, the radio station is 5 kilowatts of power sitting there, 800 feet away. RCA could not tell them that it would work. So that was primarily, I think, suggested by RCA to do this experiment, to find out by putting this camera in this box, could you operate without being interfered with. To do this was to keep the RF, or radio frequency 930, from getting into the camera. We didn't know when we signed on television in June of '49 what would be involved down the road. Would television make a go, or well, it's just something that's just a fancy or a hobby, or we didn't know. Well, it turned out that it took off and it grew like wildfire. And in fact, when Mr. Gaylord signed the station on, he gave as to what he thought television would do. Even then, he says it will only be a matter of time until television will be an all-day affair. You know, he thought he was kidding. You know, he was very farsighted. He was. I have been in his office many times. If anything went wrong with his television set, either his home or his office, I was the one that had to go take care of it. And I found out real quick. I would be in his office. He had a quite luxurious office, and he would ask the technical questions. Well, you know, I had to run it through my mind real quick. Now, how can I get this down on a level to where he can understand it? Well, he let me know right quick that I didn't need to do that, that he would understand it. He was very well versed. He didn't exactly know the nitty-gritty of what went on, but he knew he could carry on a very intelligent conversation with you. He knew exactly how television signal got from there to there to there to his set. There's only 2 times that I know of that I've ever seen him at the station itself. One was the signing on of the television originally, and when we had moved to the new location, and television cable had come through from NBC and all of the other networks. Of course, at that time, we were the only station in town, so we had the choice of the programming of any of the 4 networks. But basically, we was NBC, and he did sign the station on that morning at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I remember at that time, he extended his view that it would only be a matter of time until television would be running 24 hours a day. His chain of command, of course, was from he wanted something done, and of course he communicated with PA Sug, and Sug got it done. And Sug himself was a pretty good engineer. The copper cage was to prove or disprove that you could operate a television camera in the presence or under the umbrella of this tower. They proved that it could be done. So they just had this one copper box. But when they designed the building, they went a little overboard. In fact, that whole building over there was, it isn't now because they've done so much renovation to it, was a complete copper box on the outside. On the inside was another copper box. And in the studio itself was another copper box. It didn't ground to anything. It just kind of floated. That in case they were grounded to a common point ground, it was this copper hardware fluff type, and it was all soldered, all the seams, and on the roof was a solid sheet of copper. In fact, it was really a thin sheet. It was even on a brown paper to hold it. But the entire roof was a solid sheet of copper. I think it was probably part RCA's and partially the findings that we had found when they put this camera in this box to get rid of the interference. Because the band pass of the television camera is from low frequency audio all the way up to 1.5 megacycles. Well, of course, 930 kilocycles in the lower part of that, and it just goes right through, and it causes a herringbone type pattern on your picture. So actually in the studio itself, in the two studios they built, there was less energy in that room than there would be 40 miles out from WKY. Actually, it was only 800 foot from the tower, so that's how well shielded it was. Wow. So we had no problems. The voltage actually, the radio energy radiated from that tower at that point where the studio building is was approximately 2 volts in amplitude. So that's what they had to get rid of, get this down to a level, because the signals coming out of the camera tube was in the millivolts. And so they had to get this energy down, and the camera was not that well shielded. Everything was just kind of open. So they had to shield the room that you put it in, so the energy wouldn't get in the camera. And once it got in, you couldn't get rid of it. It just went right on through. We had a few locations to where we would have some problems, but most of the time we was able to solve this by the doors of the camera. It was only fastened by 2 little quick connectors. And I know of a couple occasions where we were very close to a radio station, and we found that you could take aluminum tape, 2-inch wide aluminum tape, and just stick this over around the edges of the door, and if you did it. When we did this, no other television station had ever moved under their radio antenna. It was quite common that a radio station, an old established radio station, went into television. But usually their television or their radio broadcast transmitter was out away from their studio. So we was very unique in moving the studio out under the broadcast antenna. We were the first people to do that. So it was kind of pioneering on our part. The TV studio and the home set was in the little theater of the Municipal Auditorium. The radio studio was on the 5th floor of the Skirvin Hotel, Skirvin Tower Hotel. They was in the same building, but if somebody in radio needed something that I could handle, we did it, or vice versa. It was not a complete separate operation, no. They did their thing and we did our thing, but yet if they needed help, we helped, and they did also. The schematics was no problem for me, because I did this before I went to the Navy, and then I taught naval radar for almost 3 years. Schematic reading was no problem. The Navy, I joined the Navy for radar training. Of course, the word radar then was secret. All I knew was that it was secret. I didn't even know what it was. When I joined, they didn't know what to do with me, because I had quite a bit of radio training, or radio background, and they give me this quiz. I must have did pretty well on it. I really don't know what I did, but they said, well, due to your age, we can only give you Seaman First Class. You know, I wasn't 21 years old then. And so when I taken the oath there in Little Rock, they sent me to New Orleans, the receiving station, and there was approximately 30 some people. There's even Seaman First, Petty Officer Third, Petty Officer Second, depending on the old radio people, radio service people, basically what they were. They had nothing for us to do. They gave us no military training whatsoever. We were just there. And when I was there, I think about 40-some days, and they sent us to Texas A&M. It's what they called a pre-radio school, which was a 12-week course. And Texas A&M was trying to uphold their scholastic record of excellence. And what they tried to do was give us the same technical training in 12 weeks they gave the Texas Aggies in 4 years.
Wow.
And it was rough.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I had not been out of high school very long, and my math was not escaped me. But they flunked out an awful lot of good radio people that had been out of school, say, 5-10 years, and they had not used their mathematical background, or maybe they didn't have the background to start with, I don't know. But many of them had been running their own service shops or whatever, and they flunked out a lot of people that was good radio people because they couldn't handle the math.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember there was almost 250 started the class, and there was only 130 graduated. But even I had trouble with math, and I was not that far away from it. On the completion of the Texas A&M course, they had two choices. You could go to Treasure Island, which is shipboard equipment, or to Corpus Christi, which was airborne equipment. Well, at that time, I didn't want anything to do with airplanes. I applied for Treasure Island, and I think they threw everything away, and it says, you go to Corpus Christi. Well, that's how I ended up in Corpus Christi, and that was at that time it was only about a 6-month course. And on the completing of that course, they was continually expanding their curriculum, and they pulled me out for instructor. I stayed there for the duration as instructor at the island. And that's, of course, Sud was not at the base at that time. He came along later. And I I think, in fact, I have the list somewhere in my archives. When he left the base after the war, he'd taken this list with him of all the possible people that he would need if he ever needed any. And when they got this television permit, why, he wrote letters to the people that he thought that he might want on his staff, and I happened to be one of them. And like I say, there's 4 or 5 others involved that was at the island. There was all kinds of technical problems that would arise. But most of them, they didn't tell us that you couldn't do it, so we went ahead and did it. We found a way of doing it. One of the biggest problems, like, let me backtrack when we were first trying to get started on the air, was to get a television signal from the little theater to the transmitter building out here on Britton Road.
Right.
In this package was 3 microwave transmitters and receivers. We set up at the studio. I was not involved in that initially, but I knew it was going on because we had the receiver out here on this end, which I was partially involved with, and we could not get a signal from there to here. It wouldn't go. But yet you take the equipment and put them together, and they had a 10-mile attenuator, they call it, that you put between them. Which actually, if you had the equipment 10 miles apart, this was all in this piece of waveguide, so that you could check them here and here without being separated. The equipment worked fine.
So it's duplicated that distance.
Yeah, it was just 10 miles in 2 feet. That's what it was. We decided, well, maybe we just not high enough down here. So back in those days, KTOW was at the top of the Apco Tower, Ramsey Tower, or Liberty Bank Building, the old Liberty, whichever way you want to call it, now Globe Life.
Right.
Elmo Black being the chief engineer up there on the top floor. He and Bob Hayward was very good friends, and he called him to see if he had access to the roof. You know, we want to go up there and see if we can set up microwave and send the signal out on them over. Well, I was not on the roof at that time, but I got there later. We could not, from that height, and from there you could see the building sitting out here in the distance. We still couldn't get a signal across. Wouldn't go. Everything seemed to be functioning properly. In fact, we proved it. We set them together. So we had worked with it some off and on for 2 weeks. Of course, this was in the early spring of '49. The chief engineer got desperate and got RCA to lend a helping hand. So they sent a technician down, and we had the equipment available, and we went up on top of the building. He checked to make sure the equipment was operating. No signal. He began to notice something. He says, that feed, they called it a feed horn, which is, it looked like a button hook that went out and focused the signal back onto this parabolic dish. He says, that doesn't look right. He got out his book, and there was a number, and he looked his number up, and he says, that's the wrong feed horn. He says, that's for a 6-foot dish, and it's about 18 inches longer than the 4-foot feed horn. They won't work. He said, you've got a shorter feed horn. No, we didn't. RCA never provided us with a shorter when they sent us all the long ones. But we didn't know the difference. So when we got the right feed horn, then it was no problem. We got a signal through. So then later very shortly thereafter, we set up on top of the municipal auditorium and shot straight out to the building. This was, like in March or April. And we built a stand right on top of the auditorium to get this signal out here. And we noticed, or the people at the transmitter began to notice, that the signal was going down. Every day, the meter reading would be a little bit less. Every day, just a gradual reduce. Well, he thought maybe it was tubes going bad or something, and we thought the same thing, but what we found out was that it was the leaves on the trees spreading out in spring up there on 13th Street, along about. It was a ridge up there that we was not line of sight, and these leaves coming out was absorbing the signal. Along these on around 13th, 15th Street is a small ridge, and it's not completely line of sight. And at this frequency, it almost has to be line of sight. And the leaves was coming out on the trees, and they was absorbing the energy. That's the 4-foot dig. So we put a 20-foot extension on top of the transmitter building, an old windmill tower that was on the place when they bought it. In fact, it's right there. That helped. But as the days went on, the signal got down. And it ended up, we had to put a 60-foot windmill tower on top of the municipal auditorium to get enough signal out to stay on the air. But not until after we signed on the air, and for a while we had to shoot from the municipal auditorium to the top of the APCO tower and then to the transmitter. Had to use that as a relay. Well, the problem came, at that time we was doing one scheduled remote a week, which was the Friday night wrestling at the old Stockyards Coliseum. So sometime in early evening, we would switch over back to the direct link because we had to use the equipment at the APCO to get the Coliseum in and down to the studio. So we had to do some quick reversing there. So I'd say it was long in July. I know it was pretty warm weather. We did it ourselves. We put up the tower on top of this auditorium. And from this 55-foot or 60-foot, and then the 20-foot on this end, we had, I guess, line of sight because we didn't have any signal problems. The higher the frequency, the more direct you have to be from point to point. Like at the radio spectrum, the wavelength is fairly long and it tends to bend right on around the Earth. The higher the frequency, it tends to go more in a straight line. The higher the frequency, the more the straight line. And so the television signal was, back in those days, was considered a fairly high frequency. And receivers did not have the sensitivity that they now have. And of course, back in the early days, we didn't have the television power we have today. So the first transmitter was only a 5 kilowatt transmitter. That was all that was made. And so the people out in the outlying areas, if they had line of sight, they was fortunate. And even then, they would put up massive antennas trying to get the signal in. I had long discussions with Mr. Sugg and also Mr. Lovell, and Hoyt Andres, which was the assistant manager, about how to solve these problems, and even they got me involved in helping solve some of the problems in outlying communities, and going out and surveying, well, what kind of antenna will they have to put up to get a useful signal, to get a picture. Of course, at that time, we was the only station on in the whole in Oklahoma, and the only other station on in the southwest was Channel 5 in Fort Worth. Amarillo did not have a station at that time, and I remember being at my brother-in-law's in Border, Texas on a weekend, and he says, well, why don't you go over to the school and see what your station looks like. A friend of his had set up a massive antenna. It was 100 feet or better high, massive looking antenna, which was 220 miles. And they was getting WKY-TV at that distance. Not real good. It was right snowy. Now, at certain atmospheric conditions, they had a real good picture. At times they didn't have anything, just snow. But of course, there was no interference from other stations on the same channel, so there wasn't any. So the people at that, even at that distance, would spend quite a little money putting up large antennas to get a picture. This was, you probably heard of the freeze mentioned.
I have not, no.
Okay. When WKY applied for the license, for some reason they were stalling, or, you know, well, we want you, but we're not going to do it right now. Their attorneys in Washington, because there were some stations on the air on the East Coast, immediately they ran into problems. Because the commission had decided, well, the television signal goes out there 70 miles, stops. It don't work like that. It just keeps going and going and going. Well, what they had found out was they had interference problems. Well, to solve the problem, they decided, well, we will not allocate any more channels till we find out what we're doing. So we will put a freeze on allocating new television channels. And the attorneys in Washington got a hold of, I guess, what this does. It says, if you want this license, do it today. Get this application in, because there will be a freeze put on Monday. Unless your application is in, you will not be granted a license until after their study, which may be 6 months or a year, which turned out it was about that long, or maybe longer. So they hastily got this application together and assured the attorney that would be on his desk Monday morning. Well, somebody dropped the ball, and they gave the application to a page boy to drop in the mail, and he didn't do it. Monday morning, he still had it. Well, the attorney calls to where is this application? Well, it's been mailed to you. I don't have it. It turned out it was still here in Oklahoma City. But the attorney had enough power and got it through, and they got this thing out there and got it just barely under the wire, so that they could be allocated a channel. Now, they had applied for Channel 4 on the onset by recommendations of RCA and NBC. That Channel 4 seemed to be the best channel for distance operating and less interference from other sources. At one time, right after the freeze, I know we could have gone to Channel 7, which I think would have been a great move. 7 was also a great frequency. Of course, channel 7 now is occupied by law.
Right. Yeah.
But we could have gone to channel 7, and that would have given us, we could operate at 316,000 watts effective radiation, whereas on channel 4 you can only operate at 100,000 watts effective radiation. According to the Commission and all their engineering figures, channel 4's 100,000 watts is supposed to go as far as channel 7's 316,000 watts. Well, it don't quite work out that way. So if you figure some of the, like channel 9, they're running 316,000 watts. They got more coverage out in the outlying area, in some areas, channel 4 does. I don't know whether it was Sugg or Sugg and Gaylord, or probably both, but early in the television game, Sugg placed an order for RCA if they ever adopted a color standard. He wanted cameras. Even in February of 49, when I were in New Jersey, I visited the Princeton laboratory. I saw color television. Beautiful color, but you couldn't transmit it. It would have taken up 18 megacycles of bandwidth. Well, you've only got 4.5 to do everything. Color, audio, and black and white. So actually this 18 megacycle spectrum produced a beautiful picture. Sure it did. So they had color. Of course, they didn't have a color camera, they had color slide equipment. Like 2x2 slide, was all that they had at that time. A film camera, or of course the equipment that they had, they called it flying spot scanner, which gave a beautiful picture. Just a 2x2 slide. And that was the only color equipment that they had at that time. And the flying spot was created by a high intensity tube. And by lenses, they focused this onto the slide. And then they had color splitting mirrors out here, so if it was in the green spectrum, it went one way, and if it went to red, it went here, and blue another. And this was all picked up by sensitive tubes. And then you had 3 complete separate television signals. You had a red one, a blue one, and a green one. And then what you did with it from there, of course, back in those days, they had no way of encoding it. They had built up a color monitor of a sort. Of course, then it was about a 12-inch screen. But they were feeding it with 3 specific signals. The red one, the blue one, and the green one. And, of course, it presented real good pictures. So I would say back in those days, somewhere along in there, Sugg had placed an order because the Commission had not adopted a color standard. But he placed the order that in the event a standard was adopted, that he would have an order resting right there. So in October of 53, the Commission adopted this, what is called the NTSC standard. I know the transmitter supervisor, I went to San Antonio, Texas, to a SMTTE seminar, of which they showed the color and how it was derived, and how it could be transmitted over the standard channel. NTSC, that's the National Television Society
but the other.
It was a committee that was derived of engineering people, RCA, the commission people, and all that had gotten together to find out how to do this. Well, there were 2 or 3 different models of things that had came up. In fact, CBS, if you remember back in the early days, before they adopted the NTSC system, CBS came out with this rotating wheel, sequential, a red, blue, and a green on this wheel. Well, if you had one in front of your black and white set, and they had one in front of the camera, and you had them synchronized, you had a fairly good color picture. But it was all mechanical. And keeping those things synchronized was not a very good thing. You know, you got this big flying wheel out there in front of your TV. So it was not too practical. So when they came out with the electronic method, NTSC, which we now use, was adopted in somewhere in October of '53. Of course, they didn't have any cameras made, but our order was still resting there. So then hastily, everybody wanted to get cameras. Of course, the networks, NBC primarily, because they was the RCA owned, they naturally got the first choice. CBS placed their orders, but they was out under us. And ABC hadn't done anything at that time. And of course, Dumont was almost out of the picture at that time. In desperation, I'd say it was about right after the first of the year in '54. RCA hastily had gotten a camera design that they probably was pretty well along at the time anyhow, so they could manufacture a camera. Well, we was to get cameras immediately after NBC, which we did. They had placed an order not knowing what to place. They had placed an order for 3 cameras, but 2 consistent. It takes an awful lot of peripheral equipment to make a color camera work. The camera, they decided, was the most technical part of it, so we'll buy 3 of those, and then we'll have a spare. The monitor and your control equipment and the encoding equipment, they decided, well, we'll just buy 2 of those, expense-wise, which was several $100,000 less. So when we received the camera equipment, we received serial number 7 and 11. The other cameras went to NBC, New York. Okay, CBS called us to find out if there was any way that he would give up one of his cameras, so that they would have a camera to do some color. So they was desperate, competition-wise.
Yeah.
So he relinquished the 3rd camera. So then our cameras then was serial number 7, 11, and 34. Well, that's why the span between 11 and 34. CBS came in there and got that. Of course, actually, we did not need the camera, so we had nothing to make it work unless we take one of the others out of service. So I remember the first color equipment that we received was in late December of '53, which was a color monitor. Just a monitor. And NBC was supposed to do some color on one of the parades. I don't remember. Rose Bowl, I don't remember. I know they were supposed to be doing some color. Of course, the radio coming into Oklahoma City was all by some microwave and some coax cable. The band limiting factor of the coax would not permit any color to come down it. So we didn't see any color. And right after the first of the year, there was one or two programs that NBC had put on once a week within color. We didn't see any color. The cable wiped it all off. Band passed, so the cable wouldn't permit us to go through. When we received the camera equipment, I don't remember, I know it was only a very short while, but when we received the equipment, immediately Mr. Suggs, that's him there, we will sign on in color and give a date. We didn't see any way possible. So when he says you'll do it, you'll do it. He knew pretty well what had to be done. He was not, he was fairly technical. He knew what had to be done, actually, to the fine point. He didn't. But he knew that we could do it. He knew that he had the staff to do it. I took the bull to the horns, and I think it was in December of '53, just before Christmas, I remember. The company sent me to RCA again for color training for 2 weeks. Of course, by then, I knew what made television work, and it's just a matter of then making 3 signals, get them into 1 signal, going from there. So when we started getting the equipment, it was put under me to take me in and get all this installed and do it. So I know they sent in an RCA man to help us, and right off the bat I found out that of course he knew less about it than we did. So we was in trouble. So I put him off in some minor detail while we went ahead installing this equipment to make it work. And we met our sign-on date, which was in March of '54, in color. Mr. Lovell was the chief engineer. Aaron Britton and I was the basic two. They sent Aaron to New York, to the New York studios, to set in with their people in producing color signals. And I don't know, it seemed like he spent a month there, along in January and somewhere along in February. Well, and after he came back and we had just gotten the equipment in, Mr. Lovell got a hold of Aaron, myself, and Ed Leach. Because color was new to us. We had a book about like, yay, here's you one, here's you one, you one. You will teach the rest of the crew color television. So I taken one area of it, Aaron Britton taking one area of it, and Ed Leach taking one area of it, and we actually got Chrissy Thomas, which you may somewhere along the line, in on it. And once a week, engineering and anyone else, artists, lighting people, camera operators, or anyone that wanted to set in on our sessions. And actually, we then taught color to our people. from this is what we've got to do, this is how you do it. Aaron's was, he was more of an artist on getting a perfect picture. Ned's was more in another area. My area was the encoding and making sure that after we got the 3 signals, so I had to teach the encoder to them as to how you take 3 signals and make 1 signal out of it.
And you see you got Prissy Thomas in it.
Prissy Thomas, her part of it was color psychology. She had a show on, I don't know whether it was a daily or twice weekly or so.
Is that a cooking program?
No, she was part of that. Sybil Johnson was in charge of the cooking program basically, but Prissy had a kind of an interview show. She understood basic color, not the light theory, but the paint theory. As to what colors that you could use with it, and how it would affect people in various ways, psychologically. That was her part of it. The art people was in on this, set design, the background, and the television equipment, the camera back in those days. The tubes was, pickup tube was not exactly perfect. So we had to stay away from certain areas, like symphony. That was one of our first pickups in color, would you believe, was to pick up a symphony in our studio. Well, you know how symphony people dress. It's a black with a bright white shirt. Right. Those are the 2 things you got to stay away from. But we handled it fairly well. And being that we got off of the ground early in color television, we learned how to do things. RCA couldn't tell us. They had not experienced NBC. They just took from RCA and said, well, this is how you do it. They didn't know. And I don't know, it was early in the color game. I don't know, it probably had to be late 54, it might have been 55. But it was in this, somewhere in this time frame. But Channel 4 was the only station in the world to transmit or to create local color television, other than the network. So the network was kind of interested in what we could do. They sent people down here to observe our operation. Of course, we had people observing their operation back there as well. And we had a roller skating derby of some sort. And of course, color television wasn't portable in those days. So they moved us into Studio C, which was a studio 33 by 66 feet. And we had 2 cameras operating. We had the 3 cameras, but of course the other one was inoperable to the control equipment. So this had pretty, it was interesting to NBC. And they decided, well, why don't we take a broadcast from Oklahoma City Channel 4, because we had cut a lot of stuff in black and white over the years. Let's see what they can do in color. They had sold it to NBC, so it went national, NBC. We put it right out of Studio C. We take one of these cameras And the cameras weighed 300 pounds, less the pedestal. The pedestal weighed at least that much. And we put this on a forklift, electric forklift, which we had rented from some company, and put this camera on this forklift to where the camera they could raise it and lower it to get up to see these skaters out here doing their thing. And the camera, the operator of the forklift, the skaters came in ahead of him. Well, here he goes trucking back to 66 feet because he was flung to the back door. They was coming in the back door of the studio. The skaters came past him. And when he came back, he just almost went through this wall. But he stopped at his time. Like I said, you could just see everything going. Because he was coming back, I mean, full speed with that forklift across that floor. But anyhow, after the show was over, Aaron Britton had several good contacts with NBC, being up there for a month. One of the people who was observing the show up there called him. He says, "What kind of camera equipment are you using?" "Well, it's only RCA. Nobody had one at that time." He said, "Oh, it's TK40. Same as you got." "No, you can't get that kind of pictures on TK40s." "Well, we do." And they were flat amazed. We had the time, Aaron, myself, and the rest of the crew, we had the time to work on it. And we found out how to make white. That was one of the problems that RCA had not solved. You take a white shirt,
Instead of a burn like this.
it might turn out pink on one camera, it might turn out bluish on another camera. They had not learned how to control it. Well, Aaron was pretty, like I say, he was a perfectionist. So, with my help, he knew what he wanted to do. So he worked very close with me, and I said, "Okay, this is the way we'll do it," and we did. We made white and black, which RCA had not learned to do yet. So when they saw these pictures, because these costumes that the skaters had on, some of them were white. But when they got to New York, they were still white. They couldn't understand that, and the cameras matched. This one was white, and this one was white. This one didn't turn pink, and this one didn't turn purple. Which they was flat amazed that that's why they called immediately and wanted to find out what kind of camera equipment are you using. We created this white electronically by controlling the inner workings of the camera itself. Aaron knew what he wanted to do. He didn't know exactly how to do it, but he knew what he wanted to accomplish. When he came to me and he says, "To make white, this is what we've got to do." So then the three of us, or four of us, or two of us, we got our heads together and okay, we can do it. And over a period of a little time, we worked out exactly how to do it, and we did it. So, in fact, even after that, there was people from all over the whole U.S. would come to Channel 4 to observe our operation. KROA in San Francisco, to be one specific, he spent a week here with us. People out of Chicago and other stations throughout the whole U.S. come to observe our operation. Actually, what we were doing, how we did it, and so forth in color. Of course, there weren't many color receivers in those days, and what there was pretty expensive. But we stayed on color, producing at least 1 or 2 shows a day for 2 or 3 years, and then kind of slacked off to 1 a week for a good long time. And I remember we had the 3rd camera, but we could not operate it. We had a flying spot scanner, which was practically worthless, so the only thing you could do was transmit slides. You couldn't produce any film, 16 millimeter. And there was no way to go from one slide to another other than by just pushing it in front of the lens, which was not too good didn't look good on the air. So RCA had come out with what they call a 3V system, or 3 Vidicons, for film and slide pickup, which we had put in late '54. So we had taken the flying spot scanner out of service. The only thing we ever used it for was just set a slide up there on it, and we would go to it as a breakaway shot, then go back to the studio and put another slide and go back to it. That's all you could do, which wasn't too practical. But the control equipment was similar. So WKY-TV in Fort Worth had updated their TK40s to a TK41. Basically, it meant a whole new control, but the same camera body. And I got a hold of the chief engineer at Fort Worth, asked him if he had any of this terminal equipment that he had taken out when he updated his camera. He said, "Yeah, I got it all out here. What do you need?" I told him what my message was, and he said, "Well, yeah." He had a terminal chassis with all the cables connected to go in and out. The encoder we had, the channel amp we had, but we didn't have the main control panel, which was different. So he had that. So about 3 or 4 pieces of equipment, what they had and what we could build up. Because the management come to me in, I guess, July of that year, it was '66. Says, "We will hit the air September the 1st, full color, everything."
Wow.
I couldn't see any way, you know. It just left me in awe. Well, we only had the 2 operating cameras, and I could build up this other one, and I found out how to get these pieces. So we built up the 3rd camera. So what we ended up doing was use the camera that we built up in Studio B permanent. It didn't move, but the other 2 cameras moved from Studio B to C. And we did an awful lot of commercials and shows in both studios. And we had to drag those cameras because you couldn't dare unplug them and take them over, because it's 2 hours to get them back in operation once you turned it off. And
that's because of the heating up the tube.
Right. So I remember being down at one of the local TV suppliers in August, and I was looking for my personal use, the color television set. And long in August, they were trying to get rid of it. And they had some fairly good deals going. Well, I think about 2 days, it might have been a week before, they put out a Oklahoma full-fledged insert. WKY-TV goes full color September 1st. Well, it blew everybody out of the water. In fact, one of the suppliers that I had been talking to on the color television set set that I really wanted, they was out of, and they wasn't selling too well, so the color, there just wasn't that much color. NBC was only doing 2 or 3 shows a week, and we was doing 1 or 2 shows a week, and that's about it. So he called me and he says, "Why didn't you tell me?" Wholesaler says, "Why didn't you tell me?" Well, I didn't feel that it was my duty to go under the table and tell them. I figured if management wanted to know, they would advise them. But they didn't tell anybody until it came out in the newspaper. We will go full color September the 1st. So a lot of people and the wholesalers have not gone heavy on color television because they just wasn't moving too well until, you know, we made the big splash, and NBC made a big splash at the same time to go color. A lot more color. So color television sales just went right off the way. When we made our first, before we signed on officially in color on the air, we was producing color television pictures for in-house purposes. And this was in, say, April of '54. We set up a show and brought all of the wholesalers, people, and advertising agencies out for a showing to show them color television. Because most of them had never seen a color television. What we did in Studio C, we set up about a 15-minute broadcast of something that we could just in one end, and we had various receivers around the area, various brands that we could get, and had jeeped them to where we could drive them from camera equipment rather than off the air to get a color picture into them. And I know there's 4 or 5 different brands, and we invited all these people out. We had them out for a dinner and then set them all down to entertain them and show them color. Some 15 or 20 people per set. And when we started to show this, we had a beautiful bouquet of flowers. Beautiful. On front of the camera, lighted. They could see it because it was up in front of the studio. But I had installed a switch in the equipment that it was black and white. In other words, it is black and white. Well, when we started this show, here come up the bouquet of flowers, black and white. I flipped the switch and went color. And it was beautiful. People were just awed at it. I thought one of the amazing quips of the day, the Oklahoman had sent out a camera reporter to cover the story, which I knew very well. I was well acquainted with him. And I was always going back and forth to the studio to make sure that the set was right and that everything was just perfect. And he caught me in the corridor, a little passageway, sound lock between the studio and the control room. And he said, "Say, is that picture good? Is that good color?" "Well, yeah, it's good color." Well, he says, "They sent me out here to cover this story, and I'm colorblind." I thought that was kind of hilarious. He says, "All looks the same to me." It was very spectacular. All of the agencies and set suppliers was flat amazed on how pretty color could look. And color sales started up a little bit. Of course, due to the lack of color broadcasting, they kind of slacked off from about 55 on up till middle 60s. It was just kind of gradual. Then 66, we went full color, and then it just went right on its way. The engineering was probably by our promotion department, because I know they got with us as this is what we want to do. We want to show agencies and some of the VIPs of Oklahoma City, color television. We want to do a private showing before we go on the air with color. So we all got together. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it, and they organized it from there. But I would say, wouldn't surprise me that it was probably PA Sub, because he was a man with a lot of fire, and when he had something to show, he showed it. He had something to do, he got it done. Channel 9 came on the air, and they could not get a license until the freeze was lifted, and that was in the early 50s somewhere. So we had been on the air some 2 or 3 years before they became on the air. They did not do anything in color for quite a while. They came, of course, RCA was the first supplier of color camera equipment. GE made a color camera very similar to the one that RCA had that really never got off the ground. And transistor circuitry began to come into life in I'd say the 60s. There was quite a back of engineering. Transistor circuitry, we did not get any equipment until late 66, any transistor circuitry. I think what had happened when the station decided to go full color, they had ordered new cameras from RCA. RCA couldn't deliver, and I think that's why the pressure was put on our people. We've committed ourselves, we're going to do it. So we did it with what we had. Now we signed on in September full color. And it was long about October, late October, early November. We received 4 color cameras from RCA, and the camera size was almost the same size as the original, which is the same, very similar to the type you have on display. Weighed 300 pounds. But a large amount of the circuitry was in the camera, but it was transistorized. The tubes themselves, they had gone to a 4-tube pickup rather than a 3-tube pickup. They used a 4.5-inch tube to pick up what they call the black and white signal, and 3 1-inch tubes, Vidicons, to pick up the color signals. The concept had merit, but it had the practical application of it was not too good. I know we got the cameras, we got them in, installed them, and we kept going right on with what we was doing with the old equipment. And when we got the new camera equipment operating, and the RCA people were here to help us set it up, we could not get a picture that pointed out of it. It just didn't look right. color wasn't right, and it didn't perform like we wanted it to perform. And there was an awful lot of heated discussion between RCA and the station. If that camera had to perform, where do you want to set? It got that bad. In fact, red didn't look red. Red looked orange. Well, what they have done in the design of the equipment was change the separation, color separation, really trying to get more light through it. Well, in doing so, it changed the color imagery. And that was just one of the problems. Well, they finally got the right man down here, and with proper trimming filters, got the color to where it would match what we were getting, that we were relatively happy with. So our idea was to use 2 cameras in Studio B, 2 cameras in Studio C. That way we would have this shuffle. We put the cameras on the air. We didn't go on air until up in February. It was that long, trying to get a decent picture out of it. In Studio B, we was to switch over to the new cameras on the 6 o'clock box. In other words, the noon stuff done on the old TK40s, and the 6 o'clock news and weather would be done on the new cameras. I came home long about just before they hit the air. Everything was ready. I was reasonably happy with it. Right after the show, 30-minute show, Aaron Britton called me. Well, look, we got a problem. He says, that camera completely went out of registration between the weather and news.
Which means it was no longer adjusted to.
Well, see, you've got to take 3 images and completely put them on top of one another. Well, if one moves over, then you have funny paper effect.
Right.
So, and that's called registering the camera. You've got knobs to make 1 image out of 3.
Right.
And a bunch of knobs to do it. They would all transistor circuitry, other than the pickup tubes themselves. I said, I'll be over. I came over, and he says, in going from news to weather, I had to completely re-register that camera, because I just barely made it. And it wasn't perfect, but I just, I got it into where it was usable. And the sets were set up in the studio at that time. The news set was on the west wall. The weather set was on the east wall. So you would have a turn 180 degrees with the camera, pointing east to get weather, pointing west to get news. He showed me the registration chart on the thing. He set it up there, the mic and the news set. And he says all we did was turn the camera around. And he says apparently the jostling or something took it completely out of registration. I got my thinking cap on. I said, the camera is set up pretty well up here. I said, let's go down in the studio, move this registration chart over to the weather set, turn the lights on the weather set. Look, all it is black and white lines, vertical and horizontal lines, and wedges. There's no color on it at all. That you all you do is just make one black and white picture out of it.
You're matching the tree.
Take the tree and overlay 3 pictures.
All right. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So we did, and it's completely unreached. Blue was out, red was out, you know, like a ½ inch on a 21-inch monitor, which is a long way. All right, let's turn it back around. Turn it back around, pointing west, and it was registered. There's your answer. Earth's magnetic field. We had problems with this. What tipped me off was our early black and white cameras had problems with the Earth's magnetic field. That if we would be pointing west, and if we pointed east, we had to make minor adjustments, bring back and focus. The shielding of the tube was not perfect. Well, in their next vintage of cameras, they had better shielding, and in the TK40 cameras, they had better shielding. We didn't have this problem. Aaron had forgotten about it. That's when they built this new TK41, they called it. That's a problem. I called RCA. In fact, the RCA man was still here. He was not left. He laid it onto everything, including the building was being magnetized, the radio stations causing it. And we even went as far as to take one of those cameras and put it on a flatbed truck as far as the cable could get it away from the building, which was about 300 feet, 400 feet. We still had the problem. So that's when he decided that it was the radio station that was causing it. And he wanted to turn the radio transmitter on. Well, sorry, we can't do that. We can only turn it off. It will be off the air Sunday night, 5:30 till 6. Sunday morning. That's it. He said, well, let's make a check. So we did set up. We had the camera registered and had him turn the transmitter off. He could not tell us when the man turned the transmitter on or off. So it was not a radio problem. So we owned a station in Tampa, Florida at the time, which had got the cameras about the same time we did. They was not in color before, so they was using them. They was, you know, they doing color. They was relatively happy to get color. So I had been to Tampa many times. I was the one that they always sent around to all of the stations to solve their technical problems. He said, no, we have no major problems. I said, I want you to do an experiment for me. If you got time. He said, okay. I said, I want you to point the camera west on the registration chart and register it. Then without changing any of the adjustments on the camera, just turn it 180 degrees, set the chart out on east, point the camera east, and call me back. It seemed like it was a very short while. Well, he apparently had the cameras on and everything was relatively set. He called me back and he said, I don't believe it. So the camera's completely unregistered. I said, that's what I'm talking about. I said, RCA says they don't have this problem. Well, their sets, they never changed direction. You know, they was always facing north or south, or they never changed it. Because, well, if you went from north to south, it was pretty good shape. But if you went from east to west, cutting the Earth's magnetic field was the worst thing. So that's when we finally got RCA's attention that they really had a problem. And they sent a design engineer of the yoke, the deflection yoke on the tubes, which I had met up in Camden sometime along the line. I know we picked him up at the airport, bring him out to the studio to show him the problem. we did this experiment by pointing it west and east, and completely went out of registration. He said, well, take me back to the airport. He went back to the airport, and in 1 week, he came back with 3 yolks, new design yolks for the color channel. And he says, let's put these in. We put them in. It had solved the problem about 50%. He said, okay, we still got problems. But he left those yolks with us and went back, and I'd say within a period of about a month, they sent us yolks for all cameras that were shielded well enough so this problem didn't exist. They call it a new metal shield. It's kind of a laminated steel shield that wraps around the tube and yolk to keep the Earth's magnetic field from getting into it. It was steel, though. It was steel, yeah.
And laminated?
Laminated, some kind of high tensile steel to keep the magnetic from getting inside it, just to shield it to get it out. In '73, they sold to Detroit Evening News in Detroit. And that's when they changed the call letters to KTVY. And then, in fact, I just went on up the ladder, and then later I became chief engineer. I'm trying to remember, Detroit Evening News got into a financial problem, and one of these hostile takeover type things, which didn't materialize, they ending up having to sell all of their broadcast facilities. They owned 2 or 3 other stations. I believe it was 85, they sold the station to Night. Well, no, actually sold it to Gannett. They sold all of their broadcast facilities to Gannett. But before they could make this sellout or change, they had to make some arrangements to diverse 3 locations of which Gannett already had stations. One was Oklahoma City, being Channel 5 was a Gannett station. Tucson, Arizona, the other, and Mobile, Alabama. There was a Gannett station already in the area. So Gannett had to get some method, either get rid of their existing Gannett station or sell off before the commission would agree to the sale. So it ended up the Knight Ritter Company bought those 3 stations from Gannett out of Miami. So then Gannett could take over the existing Detroit Evening News. And Detroit Evening, or the Gannett operation, Knight Ritter operation, was sort of new in broadcasting. There was about 7 or 8 stations in the group. And right off the bat, I could see that they did not understand Oklahoma City broadcasting. Oklahoma City broadcasting is and was unique. Because of the foresight of our prior management, it had to be perfect. We had to do things right. Consequently, the other stations had to follow suit, or they wasn't in the market. So all of the 3 major stations in Oklahoma City was superior in operation to any other in the nation as far as broadcast, technically and broadcast quality. They didn't understand Oklahoma City broadcasting. We had a rather large crew. We were doing a tremendous amount of remote work. We had a full-fledged 6-camera mobile unit, which went from coast to coast, border to border. Plus, we had a smaller unit, which was a GM motor home, with 2 cameras that we used to go out around here, and it had been on other locations doing commercials, like it has been as far as Colorado, Estes Park. I think about as far as it had been, was in conjunction with our big unit when we were doing some programs for Nashville on the Road. We did an awful lot of programs for out of state, Nashville on the Road being one of them. We did a lot of sports for anybody. We did more for ABC than we did for NBC. We did an awful lot for CBS and other Midley Network, a lot of the other sports networks. We did a lot for all of them. So we was heavy in remote. So the new company, we continued that until for 6 months. And when they sent in a new manager, and they no more remote. We don't do no sports. We don't do nothing. So that's a very sizable amount, many thousands of dollars per month. A lot of these remotes, you go out and do a football game, and it wouldn't have to be very sophisticated to go $25,000. I continued with the company until they brought in a new manager. They sent in a new manager. He came here from Mobile, but it was directed out of the Miami office. And this was late August, '86. And the day after Labor Day, I was on vacation when all this happened, and I was notified about it. I called to find out about it. When I got back to town, which was the day after Labor Day, I met with the manager, the new manager, and he had decided that I should take retirement. So I stayed with him until that time. Actually, it terminated December the 31st, '86. They kept me on from September until the end of December as a consultant. Aaron Britton took early retirement, 74, I believe it was, 73. And, he was in poor health. Lewis Parks, who was the radio, WKY radio engineering, he came into television before the split up. So he stayed, and he was a studio supervisor. He took retirement January the 1st, '86. But he was not on the ground floor of putting the television together. He didn't get into television until the middle '50s. All aspects, behind the scenes and even in front of the scenes. Of course, WKY and Channel 4 was always very creative. Engineering-wise, behind the scenes, front of the scenes. So many of the people that started at Channel 4 went on to bigger and better things. Frank McGee being one of them. This started back in the 50s. This was started by Hoyt Andre. Whenever a talent was hired, they had a list of names that they wanted him to go by. And said, okay, here's our list of names. Which one do you think you would like to be go by? So that's the way that started. And then, I don't know, it was some 10 years later or something that they dropped that. When you left the station, you left the name of the station. That was agreed. Grant Foster was another one. Jim Terrell being his real name. He is now the manager of the Gaylord Broadcasting, headquarters out of Dallas, Fort Worth. But there's also a lot of other big names to sports and news that left here and went to big time. There's more of a training. If they had talent, and if they come to WKY, they got good training. And somebody up the way would recognize that, and of course they went to bigger and better things. We could not afford to pay them what they were worth. This was primarily only in the talent end of it. Engineering did not follow suit in that. There were several that left engineering, but not to the great extent that the talent did.
Well, on behalf of the Historical Society, I want to express our appreciation for you helping us with our study, and so this concludes this interview with Willard Hines.